My cousin sat across from me at the family barbecue, smiling sweetly while she told everyone how proud she was of our little business venture together. The problem was, I had never agreed to any partnership, and I certainly hadn't signed any paperwork transferring half my company into her name. But she had absolutely no idea that the notary who stamped those forged documents remembered her face perfectly, and that single detail was about to unravel everything she'd built on a lie. Drop your city in the comments below, and let's begin. My name is Elena. I'm 33 years old, and 6 years ago, I opened a small boutique event planning company after leaving a soul-crushing corporate job that left me feeling invisible. Building the business from nothing, working weekends and holidays, turning down social invitations to chase down vendors and clients was the hardest and most rewarding thing I had ever done. I remember signing the lease on my first tiny office space with shaking hands, terrified and thrilled in equal measure, having no idea the years of 18-hour days that lay ahead of me. By the time my cousin Marisol re-entered my life 2 years ago, freshly divorced and financially struggling, my company had grown into a respected name in the local wedding and event industry. Marisol and I had been close as children, though our adult lives had drifted in very different directions. She'd married young, into what everyone assumed was a comfortable life, only for that comfort to evaporate the moment her husband left her, with significant shared debt and very little in savings. When she reached out, asking if she could shadow me at work just to learn the ropes, I welcomed her with open arms, genuinely happy to help family through a difficult chapter, remembering the summers we'd spent together as kids before adult life quietly pulled us in opposite directions. For the first several months, Marisol seemed like a genuine asset, learning quickly, charming clients effortlessly, bringing real energy into the office. I started paying her a modest salary as an event coordinator, gradually trusting her with more responsibility, even giving her limited access to certain vendor accounts and scheduling systems to make her job easier. I had no reason to suspect that. Behind her enthusiastic smile, she'd already begun quietly studying every detail of how my business operated. From our banking relationships to our legal structure, she was, in hindsight, remarkably patient, never rushing, never overreaching too, obviously, simply absorbing information, a little at a time, under the guise of professional curiosity. The first sign that something was wrong came subtly, almost invisibly. A vendor mentioned in passing that Marisol had asked unusually detailed questions about business ownership percentages during a routine call, questions that seemed oddly specific for someone in an event coordinator role. I brushed it off as simple curiosity, assuming she was just trying to understand the industry better. Looking back now, I recognize it for exactly what it was, the early groundwork of a plan she'd already begun setting into motion. Then, out of nowhere, I received a strange notification from my business bank account provider about a requested change to authorized signers on the account. Confused, I called the bank immediately, only to be told that documentation had already been submitted, including a notarized ownership transfer agreement showing Marisol as a 50% co-owner of my company, along with my supposed signature authorizing the change. I sat frozen in my kitchen, staring at my phone, completely blindsided. I had never signed any such agreement. I had never even discussed a partnership arrangement with Marisol, despite her occasional hints over the past few months about wanting more ownership in the business she claimed to love so much. When I called her directly, her voice shifted instantly from warm familiarity to something cold and defensive, insisting the paperwork was legitimate and that I'd simply forgotten signing it during a particularly hectic week months earlier. Something about her tone, too rehearsed, too immediately defensive, told me she was lying. I contacted my business attorney that same afternoon, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Whitfield, who had helped me structure the company from its earliest days. She requested copies of the notarized documents immediately, her expression growing increasingly serious as she reviewed the paperwork line by line. "Elena, this signature doesn't match any of the samples on file for you," she said carefully, sliding the document across her desk. "And more importantly, notarized documents require the signer to appear in person with valid identification. If you never appeared before this notary, we have a serious problem, but also a very traceable one." Ms. Whitfield explained that Colorado, like most states, requires notaries to maintain detailed logbooks, recording every signing they witness, including physical descriptions and identification details of anyone who appears before them. If Marisol had forged my signature and somehow presented herself as me, or convinced a notary to improperly notarize the document without my actual presence, there would be a paper trail leading directly back to her. We tracked down the notary listed on the fraudulent document, a small independent notary service operating out of a shipping and printing store across town. When Ms. Whitfield and I visited in person, the notary, a meticulous older man named Mr. Ibarra, pulled out his logbook without hesitation. He remembered the appointment clearly, he explained, because the woman who appeared claiming to be me had seemed unusually nervous throughout the entire process, fumbling with a driver's license that, upon closer inspection of his notes, listed a birth date that didn't match my actual date of birth at all. He mentioned that he'd almost turned the appointment away entirely due to her visible nervousness, a habit built from years of cautious practice that, thankfully, led him to document the encounter far more thoroughly than a typical routine signing. Mr. Ibarra had photographed the identifications presented that day, standard practice for his notary business in cases of higher value transactions. The photo, when he pulled it up, clearly showed Marisol's own driver's license, crudely altered with my name typed over her actual name, a sloppy forgery that hadn't fooled him nearly as thoroughly as she'd apparently assumed it would. Armed with the notary's sworn statement and photographic evidence, Ms. Whitfield moved quickly to file for an emergency injunction, freezing any changes to the business ownership structure while we pursued formal fraud charges. Within days, Marisol was formally confronted with the evidence during a tense meeting at my attorney's office, her carefully maintained, innocent act crumbling the moment Mr. Ibarra's photographed identification was placed in front of her. She broke down almost immediately, admitting through tears that her divorce had left her drowning in debt far worse than she'd ever let on to the family, that creditors were threatening legal action, and that she'd convinced herself, in a moment of desperate rationalization, that she deserved a share of the business she'd helped grow over the past 2 years. She hadn't planned to hurt me, she insisted repeatedly, as though intentions somehow erased the calculated forgery and fraud she'd spent months quietly orchestrating behind my back. I pressed formal criminal charges for forgery and attempted fraud, a decision that fractured relationships across our extended family, many of whom initially struggled to believe someone they'd known since childhood could be capable of something so calculated. But the evidence spoke for itself, undeniable and impossible to dismiss as family drama or miscommunication. Marisol ultimately accepted a plea agreement, receiving probation and a restitution order covering the significant legal fees I'd incurred defending my company, along with a permanent restraining order preventing her from ever contacting my business or its clients again. The 50% ownership claim was formally and permanently voided, my sole ownership fully restored and legally reaffirmed. My attorney told me afterward that cases like this rarely resolve so cleanly, and that, without Mr. Ibarra's meticulous logbook and photographed identification, the outcome could have looked very different, dragging on for years through costly civil litigation instead. 6 months have passed since that confrontation in my attorney's office, and my business has not only recovered but grown stronger, built now on much stricter internal controls and oversight that I quietly wish I'd implemented years earlier. I've since implemented mandatory dual verification for any changes to banking or ownership documentation, a safeguard born directly from nearly losing everything I'd built to someone I once trusted completely. My relationship with Marisol, understandably, no longer exists in any meaningful sense. The rest of my extended family remains divided, some quietly supportive of my decision to protect what I'd built, others still uncomfortable with how publicly the fraud became once criminal charges were filed. A few relatives suggested I should have handled it privately for the sake of family harmony, a suggestion I firmly rejected, knowing that quiet handling was exactly the kind of leniency that had allowed Marisol to believe she could get away with it in the first place. I've made peace with that division, understanding that protecting years of hard work sometimes means accepting that not everyone will stand beside you when the truth finally comes to light. Looking back, I still find it almost unbelievable how close Marisol came to succeeding, how easily an official-looking document with a forged signature could have quietly stolen half of everything I'd sacrificed years to build, if not for one small, overlooked detail. A meticulous notary who happened to remember a nervous woman with a poorly altered license. It's a strange, unsettling thing to realize that the survival of everything you've built can sometimes hinge on something as small as a stranger's careful attention to detail. Now, I want to ask you, if someone in your own family tried to steal what you'd built through forged paperwork and calculated deception, would you have pressed charges the way I did? Or would family loyalty have made you hesitate? Let me know in the comments. And please tell me which city you're watching from. Thank you for watching until the very end.